Doubtless many of you will have already seen this news, but for those who perhaps missed it somehow, Ferrari has finally gone and done what we've been wanting for a long time. What we kind of thought they were going to do a couple of times over at this point, they've named something in the F lineage again. We had the F40, the F50, before that the 288 GTO, which is part of the same run, but then of course we had the Enzo, which is a legend in its own right. Then the LaFerrari, which is probably the most dubiously named of all of them, and now, for 2027, which will be officially the anniversary, the F80, a £3.1 million car, which I'm actually kind of surprised has a production run of just under 800 units planned, which seems like an awful lot for a car like this. That's more, if I recall correctly, than Enzo's. I think there was something like 400 of those built. Now this is powered by an engine which takes influence, of course, from Formula 1, but one thing which I really like about this car is it more directly takes influence, and in a way its engine itself, in a new, freshly modified form, from Le Mans. Of course, Ferrari has come back to Le Mans in an amazing way with the 499p, and this 3-litre twin-turbo V6, kind of an underwhelming choice for a Ferrari hypercar on the surface, but it's tremendous in terms of its spec. It is of course a hybrid, as pretty much everything seems to be these days, and one of the things which I really like about it in terms of that hybrid tech is actually it has a twin-turbo system which is called E-turbos. I think part of the reason why I like this is because it's actually an idea that I had years ago as a kid. I envisioned a pre-spool system on a turbo, kind of like anti-lag really, but using permanent natural magnets to spin up a simple fan to improve the airflow before the turbo begins to spool. Kind of like a no power needed kind of pre-spool system. Of course, that wouldn't work, but this one does, thankfully, and the result is virtually no lag, tremendous performance immediately when you need it, and of course with 1,180 horsepower, it ain't gonna be slow. Incidentally, it's about 888 horses from the engine itself, which is already fantastic for that 3-litre V6, with just under 300 horses from 3 electric motors, 2, interestingly, on the front axle, not on the back, and 1 attached to the engine itself. The car has, interestingly and completely unsurprisingly for Ferrari, no electric-only mode. It's only drivable as a hybrid, and it has tons of motors all over this thing, not just for driving the car, but it has 4 motors for the suspension as well, of course being active, 2 turbo motors as well, as mentioned, and 4 motors just for the active wing setup. So tons of hybrid tech, tons of electronic tech going on here. Performance will doubtless be absolutely insane on this thing, and the 2 final things which I wanted to discuss when it comes to the F80 are, first of all, the fact that we finally have one, because for those of you who, like me, grew up as maybe a kid or a teen or perhaps beyond in the 2000s, you'll probably vividly remember, as I do, so many vaporware renderings in the early days of Photoshop where we would imagine F60s and F70s, and of course those never happened. We had the Enzo, then the LaFerrari, and now this almost feels like a nostalgic feeling to finally have an F car come back with the F80. The final thing that I want to talk about in the video though is the styling, because this is where I'm a bit mixed. Much like with the Bugatti Tourbillon, but overall I do prefer the Ferrari, I think, over the Bugatti. This to me is a car where I love a lot of the details, but something about the way it all comes together, it's not fully doing it for me. I don't know if it's just because car design has moved to a stage where I'm more nostalgic for the older times. It's possible, you know, there's a reason why our parents and grandparents always prefer the cars from their time. Maybe I'm in that stage where the 2000s will always be my favourite for supercar design. I feel like it probably will be the case. But in the case of this one, some of the things which I do love are the way the air intake integrates with kind of the door and the side window setup where it goes into that almost large NACA or NACA duct on the side, almost like a Nissan GTR's bonnet intakes. I love the fact that it has that black stripe across the bonnet, which is similar to a couple of their other models at the moment. At the same time though, I love that design, but I don't know if I love it on this car. I'm sure that certain drivers or certain owners will spec it so that it's maybe body coloured instead, and I'd really love to see that as an alternative. I also love that if you look at the car and then close your eyes or squint, it has an unusually square profile, especially over the back end, and it integrates with the wing quite nicely, and I do not think that's a mistake. I think they've quite deliberately done that to be that throwback to something like an F40, which of course is one of the squarest, one of the most chiseled supercars of all time. Even that rear wing setup, albeit active, is very F40 reminiscent for me, and of course the F50 as well. I love that the cabin almost looks like a LaFerrari. It's kind of combining multiple generations. It's got some LaFerrari in there. It's kind of got some Enzo if you squint, because that itself was a very chiseled car as well, especially over those rear haunches, the hips, if you will, of the car. And my favourite thing about this, by far, is the rear window, or lack thereof. And the reason why I love it is because, well, Le Mans. This is so GT1 on that back end. Very Porsche 911 GT1 or CLK GTR, although the Mercedes, of course, had rear windows. But this idea of having like a blanked off back end, or very Lotus Elise GT1 spec, I guess I should say, the removed or deleted rear window, again, Maserati MC12 is another prime example, with these rear-facing ducts, that will never not look awesome to me. I do kind of wish it had a roof scoop, but of course it's not a GT1, it's a hypercar, so it makes less sense to have that. But to me, that would really set off the design, having that very 90s Le Mans kind of styling. But yeah, it's a stunning looking car for sure. I will say it's a little too close for me to being like an SP3 Daytona, which I do love. But I love it as its own thing. I wish this looked a bit more set apart from that kind of car, because they're both very big looking, very square, very race car, very hypercar-esque, which makes sense. It's the time we're living in, you know, Le Mans hypercars, blah, blah, blah. But part of me does wish that this set itself apart a little bit more. Because like I said, all of those details that I've talked about, on their own, they all make sense to reference their older lineage. And I love that. But something about how it all comes together looks a little bit somehow less special to me. You know, the F40 is immediately recognisable. F50, although love it or hate it for some people, is immediately recognisable. The Enzo is one of the most recognisable designs of all time. The LaFerrari, that kind of started to move away a little bit for me. It's still recognisable, but it's a little bit more generic Ferrari to me than the ones which preceded it, and this again kind of strays even further into that kind of digital design territory, which I'm sure plenty of people love, but for me, I do prefer the swoopy, almost classical Ferraris for the most part, with the SP3 being the only real exception for me in their more recent years. That is it for my thoughts though. I'm sure those will be controversial. What's not controversial though is that its performance will be fantastic, and it's a top tier Ferrari hypercar, so it's going to be tremendous. And of course we have McLaren with the W1, we've got Mercedes with their seeming endless testing of the AMG Project 1, if that ever actually reaches the road. Hopefully we'll have some kind of new Porsche on this level as well. And we kind of get this pantheon of top tier cars that pops up every few years, rivaling each other. So yeah, very cool stuff. And of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially on the design, if you disagree or agree, down below. But of course, I'll see you next time with more news. And for now, thanks for watching.